is a 4-part lecture on the art of the Romanov dynasty. To tell this story, I am using artwork created during the time of each Romanov Tsar and artwork painted hundreds of years after their lives. During the late 1800s, Russian artists began working with pivotal events in Russian history. I am using many of these paintings to help tell the story of the Romanov dynasty. To understand the art of Russia, one must first understand its history. The art of the Romanov dynasty begins with a period of time in Russia known as the Time of Troubles. As the name depicts, Russia was experiencing challenges on every front. The stage was set with a major famine from 1601 to 1603. The government distributed money and food to the poor in Moscow, leading refugees flocking to the capital and compounding economic disorganization. Rural districts were overcome by famine and plague. This is a time of immense barbarianism as noble families committed atrocities in order to quell uprisings. Large bands of armed brigades roamed the country, committing all manners of atrocities, and the Don Cossacks on the frontier were restless, demonstrating that the central government could not keep order. Long story short, there was a state of utter confusion and disorder throughout Russia. In this painting, Appeal of Minin by Konstantin Makovsky, we see this Russian merchant appealing to the people to raise a volunteer army against the occupying forces from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Makovsky brilliantly renders the feeling of utter chaos created by the time of troubles. He sets the stage for this uphill battle the Russian people are facing. Russian folklore tells us that Minin and Prince Dmitry Pozharsky are responsible for clearing the Kremlin in Moscow of Polish forces on November 1st, 1612, thus ending the Polish-Muscovite War and setting the stage for the election of the first Romanov Tsar, Michael I. The time of troubles gave rise to the reign of Boris Godunov from 1598 to 1605. Legend tells us that Godunov descended from the Tatar prince Chet, who went from the Golden Horde to Russia and founded Ixpovsky's monastery in Kostroma, outside of Moscow. Godunov has been the subject of many theatrical performances, and for good reason. One of Godunov's first acts as Tsar was to exile key representatives of the noble families to monasteries in Poland and the far north of Russia. This, of course, included the Romanovs, who were sent to Ixpovsky Monastery. Godunov's reign was not successful, and he died of a stroke in April 1605. His son ruled for a short time thereafter. In March 1613, the Russian parliament, called Zimsky Zobar, met in order to elect a new Tsar, whose task it would be to rebuild the country. Michael Romanov was unanimously elected Tsar of Russia on April 21, 1613. In this painting, painted 30 years after Michael's death, we see the delegates of the Zimsky Zobar arriving at Ixpovsky Monastery on March 24, 1613. At this time, Michael Romanov was 16 years old. Michael I was the first Romanov Tsar, and he ruled until his death in 1645. He made peace with the warring factions throughout the country, including Sweden and Poland, and he was known as Michael the Peacemaker. So as far as art goes, Russia was still very much in the Middle Ages for a much longer period than Europe. By the 1800s, Russia was a good 300 years behind the rest of Europe. So the artwork during Michael's time was really limited to icons. And they were done in a Byzantine style, so meaning they were very flat. It is believed that religious icons are directly inspired by God, and often the people who painted these icons were monks or certainly very religious people, and there was a whole religious process to going about painting an icon. This first one is by one of the more famous icon artists, Andrei Rublev. He was a muralist as well as an icon painter, and he became a saint in 1998. Now, this particular icon predates Michael I by over 100 years. The icons are not signed. However, there are a handful of known artists who did these. It's considered one of the greatest medieval Russian icons. You can see here that the icon painters used a lot of symbols. So here we see circles around the heads of the Christ and the Virgin Mary, and that is to indicate that they're heavenly figures. The scene itself is within a square, and so the square represents earth. These are painted on wood and often in tempera paint. This is another one of his. It's a series that's at the Trefikov Gallery in Moscow. Theophanes, the Greek, they worked together in many of the churches. He was a Byzantine Greek artist, and he's very famous painter of icons around Moscow. And we can see with the colors that Russian icons are made of. It's they first started with a layer of dark brown paint, and they covered all the wood with that. That was their first layer. And then they started applying a lighter reddish ochre color and then light brown areas for highlights. To bring out the flesh and the features of the people. So the highlights were really carefully done, and they're meant to be sort of gleams of light that are emanating divine energy. The gold on the icons, this particular one is very old, and it would have been painted, the background would have been in gold, represents the kingdom of heaven. And then the eyes are often deep set inside. They did that so that when they put the highlights on the eyeballs, that it made it sort of illuminate even more. Okay, this next icon artist is Dionysus. He would be the next generation of icon painters. He was a prominent member of the Moscow school of icon painting, and he was known for a style that was called Muscovite mannerism. And here I have a slide just to compare the time period of this icon that Dionysus did around the same time that Leonardo da Vinci was painting A Lady with an Ermine in 1495. So you can just see the enormous difference between skill sets between the European artist and the Russian artist. This painting by Leonardo sold in 2016 to a private party in Poland for $3 billion. This is another icon painter, Grigory Nikitin. So he's using a more complex composition. This is even going more into time here is Fyodor Zubov, and he was a royal court painter for the next Tsar, Alexis I. And then here we see one of the most famous icons, and this is the Savior made without hands. So he was a leading icon painter of the 17th century, and he was known for depicting works of fleshy saints with human qualities. And you can see that he's getting into a much more three-dimensional quality with his work. Again, we see the brown coming through with the ochres and the light yellows. A lot of the Russian priests during the time thought his works were the works of the devil because they were too Western. And here's some more of his work. Just to compare his work, the same year, we have one of Rembrandt's last pieces that he did, last major pieces, The Return of the Prodigal Son, considered one of his greatest masterpieces. So again, I'm just showing as a comparison. They started putting frames on these icons, and it was influenced by Greek art. They began covering their icons with these elaborate frames in the 14th century. They're covered in gold or silver, and then precious stones are attached. If it has pearls on it, it's a very, very old icon. This particular photograph is The Lady of Kazan, which is from the Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg. It's considered a very highly religious and holy icon. Okay, so during Michael's time, he would have been living at the Kremlin. This is painted in the 1800s, but this artist is trying to depict what the Kremlin would have looked like. It's a site that's been inhabited since the 2nd century BC. By 1366, it was the seat of the Grand Dukes. As this painting represents 1450, Grand Prince Ivan III organized the reconstruction of the Kremlin. He got architects from Renaissance Italy to come, and they actually did a lot of the churches and cathedrals that are inside the Kremlin territory. And this is what the Kremlin looks like today. So you can see over here on the left, this big building is the palace, and then we have a number of cathedrals here, and this is a large bell tower. Initially, the red wall would have been made of wood, and then it was covered with limestone. And then the tallest building inside the Kremlin territories is the Ivan the Great Bell Tower. Assumption Cathedral construction began in August 1326. The building fell down, and then they rebuilt it in 1474, and then it collapsed with an earthquake, and then it was rebuilt, and then in 1547 there was the coronation of Ivan the Terrible here, and he was the first Tsar to be coronated in this cathedral, and ever after all the Tsars have been coronated in this cathedral. And so here we have a wall of iconostasis. So we have these icons, and they're in these elaborate gold frames, and they create an entire wall. And here's another look. Chandeliers made of gold. You have murals on all the walls and the ceiling. This is a very famous icon. She's known as the Holy Protectress of Russia. She's has the highest stature within the Russian Orthodox Church. And this image dates back to the 16th century original. And during World War II, Stalin had this icon taken in an airplane, and it was flown around Moscow 3 times to protect Moscow from the Nazis. The Cathedral of Annunciation, and so this was the private cathedral of the Tsars. And what we have here is on the main floor is where the male Tsars would be, and then on the second floor would be where the female members of the family could be. And then there's entrances. This is the palace back here, and so they enter from the palace back there. And then this is the entrance for the females going into the second floor. And then inside, this is a painting, but it shows you a good look at the inside. Began construction in 1484. It's built of brick, but it has a limestone facade outside. There's bronze doors are decorated with gold foil, and some of the doors are decorated with silver. The interior consists of a central prayer area, which is what this is showing you, and then there's several surrounding galleries. In the main area, there's a large iconostasis, and these icons date to the 14th and 17th century. And then there's murals throughout the church, and these murals are of ancient poets and philosophers, as well as biblical themes. And then these are some of the icons inside this cathedral by Andrei Rublev, and then Theophanes the Greek, and then another artist, Prokhor. Our next Romanov Tsar was Alexis I. He was the son of Tsar Michael. He ascended to the throne at the age of 16 after his father's death. On the eve of his death, he had expanded Russia to be almost 2 billion acres. In 1649, he developed a new legal code in which consolidated Russian serfdom, meaning that serfs were now considered to be the full property of all the land-owning nobility. During his reign, there was also a schism of the Russian Orthodox Church. In 1666, major reforms where people who refused to give up an old type of belief became known as the Old Believers. And this is a painting that was done in the 1880s, but it shows this schism where this woman, Boyarina, so a boyar is a noble person in Russia, and so a boyarina would be a female noble. And the Morozov family was a very wealthy family and goes back quite long period in history. And so she is an old believer. And what we have here is that she's being taken from her wealthy house, and she's being carted off to Siberia. And we have the youth of the time here are throwing rocks at her and saying nasty things. And then we have people here that are very sad and looking on. And then we have the one person here, the old monk, or beggar, we should say, who's raising the two fingers. Now, the two fingers is a sign of the old believers, whereas the new reforms would be the three, having to do with the Trinity. Another thing that happened during Alexis's rule was that many peasants, hoping to escape the burdens that they were under, fled south and joined bands of marauding Cossacks, whose leader was Razin. Razin's first considerable exploit was to destroy the great naval convoy consisting of the treasury barges of rich peasants of Moscow. Razin then sailed down the Volga, capturing the more important forts on his way and devastating the country. In 1670, Razin reached Astrakhan, a strategically important location at the mouth of the Volga River. He plundered the city, then converted Astrakhan into a Cossack republic. His aim was to establish the Cossack republic along the whole Volga River. There were 2 bloody battles with Alexis's troops, leaving the bulk of Razin's followers to be killed. Razin was captured and tortured. The Cossacks lost some of their autonomy, and the Tsar bonded more closely with the upper class because they both feared more rebellion. Alexis I had 2 wives. The first one was Maria Minoslavskaya, and the second one was Natalia Narshinkin. And so his first wife, Maria, she bore him 13 children, and she died 3 weeks after the birth of their 13th child. It went upon the Tsar to find a new wife, and they actually devised a system that was very much like Cinderella, where they sent out an invitation to all the women who were worthy of being the new wife of the Tsar. They all came to a party. The Tsar went through and picked his bride. From his first marriage, he had 6 surviving daughters and 2 sons, Fyodor and Ivan. With his second wife, he had a son and a daughter. The son was Peter. So the oldest surviving son was Fyodor, and he became Fyodor III, and he ruled Russia for a short period of time. He was considered to be highly intelligent, but he was paralyzed from a disease that he had when he was a child. So he wasn't able to walk, and he had a lot of problems with his health. This portrait of Fyodor III was commissioned by Sophia, his older sister, in 1685 and was believed to be done by the icon painter Saltanov. Here we see icon-type image of Fyodor. First at the top, of course, is Jesus, a representation of the heavenly bodies, and then right underneath that is, of course, Fyodor. Who else? The Romanov Tsar. And on either side of him, we see all the various legal legislation that he passed in his lifetime. Upon Fyodor III's death in 1682, his older sister Sophia became regent, and she wanted to be empress. Sophia spread rumors that Peter's family had poisoned her little brother Ivan V. She got the Streltsky all riled up. She told them that she would pay them to go over and kill Peter's family, and that they could take anything they wanted from their household. The Streltsky went over to Peter's house, where Ivan happened to be living. There was a big struggle. Peter's mother brought both the boys out and said, "They are fine, nothing is wrong," with Ivan. But the Streltsky could not be stopped. They killed members of the household, like their doctor and various household staff. The killing went on for 3 days. It was very bloody, and it permanently affected Peter. After this event, Peter would have uncontrollable convulsions for the rest of his life. And this is another wonderful painting. It's showing that the other thing that Sophia did is that she went and met with the old believers, and she promised them all these things that they could have if they would help her. So here we have a whole cast of characters. The fellow here holding the old icon, and you can see the frame that I was talking about. And then these crosses with the bent, those are for the old believers. So it's a whole scene here with her. So this represents Sophia's last time of trying to negotiate with a group of people to put her into power. Sophia lost this struggle. Peter won. And so what Peter did is that he ended up having Sophia put into a convent. And this is a wonderful painting by Ilya Repin, where we see Sophia in the convent. Hanging right outside her window are the bodies of the Streltsky. And so Peter did that on purpose because he wanted their rotting bodies to fill up her room. Thank you for joining me today as we took a look at the art during the first 100 years of the Romanov Dynasty. I invite you to visit Musings on Art to see other videos on art, as well as lots of articles about the art in Russia as well as Europe and Asia.